The morning it happened, I was doing the same small routine I always did before a big day. I stopped by the lobby cafe, bought a plain black coffee, and tightened the lid a little more than necessary. The air inside the building smelled like polished stone and whatever citrus cleaner they used on the floors. Nothing felt urgent yet. Just another weekday, another set of meetings, another long list of things I'd already planned for. Then I walked past the front desk. The receptionist didn't look up, not even a quick glance. Her eyes stayed fixed on the marble, like she'd found something there she couldn't stop studying. I remember thinking, for a second, that maybe she was just tired. My phone buzzed before I could take 2 more steps. An Outlook alert. Urgent performance review, 9:15 a.m., conf room 4B. All caps subject line. No message, no signature. Just a calendar block dropped into my morning like a weight. I stood still long enough for the coffee to warm my fingers through the paper cup. I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel panicked. It was more like my body noticed the shape of the situation before my mind finished naming it. A year earlier, I might have walked in without thinking. I might have assumed it was a routine check-in, a reset, a quick alignment meeting. But by then, I'd been in finance long enough to recognize certain patterns. You learn what people do when they're trying to avoid accountability. You learn what silence looks like when it's organized. I took one slow sip. Then I put the phone back in my bag. And before I went anywhere near conference room 4B, I stopped at my office and opened my locked drawer for one specific thing. A thin folder I hadn't touched in months. I didn't know yet who had booked the room. I didn't know who would be sitting inside. But I knew I'd be holding that folder later, and someone else would be reading it very carefully. That was the only clear thought I had. And then I walked. For context, I wasn't new. I wasn't struggling. I wasn't someone they'd quietly move to the edges. I'd just closed my 12th straight quarter of growth, and 3 weeks earlier, we'd landed a major institutional client, one of those accounts everyone in the executive suite liked to mention as if they'd personally negotiated it. The projections were already baked into the next 3-year revenue plan. My team's work was on the slides. My name just wasn't. As I headed down the hall, I noticed the little things I normally ignored. A few people who usually nodded at me looked away too quickly. One analyst I'd mentored for years stepped into the copy room like he'd suddenly remembered an urgent relationship with the printer. Someone else pretended to be absorbed in their phone, thumb not moving. It wasn't dramatic. Nobody ran. Nobody whispered loudly. It was quieter than that, and quiet, when it's coordinated, is usually the point. I didn't speed up. I didn't slow down. I just changed my path slightly. Took the longer loop past the internal comms board and the framed values poster that had been there since the last rebrand. The hallway lighting was too bright in a way that made everyone look a little washed out. As I passed the HR director's office, Marla's, her door was cracked. I caught the low sound of her voice, soft in that practiced way she used when she wanted to sound compassionate without committing to anything specific. The kind of tone that doesn't invite questions. I kept walking. When I reached my office, I closed the door behind me and went straight to the drawer I never left unlocked. The metal rail made that familiar sliding sound. Inside was my original employment contract and the addendum I'd negotiated the previous year after a strong Q4. 8 pages, dense language, not meant to be read quickly. I opened to the section I needed and ran my finger down the paragraph I'd memorized, the way people memorize emergency numbers. I didn't read it once. I read it twice. Then I checked the initials. Mine, Marla's, and Ethan's, our CEO, on the page he'd signed without asking for a meeting. I placed the papers back in the folder, closed it, and slid it into my leather portfolio. The portfolio felt heavier than it should have for a few sheets of paper, not because of the weight, because of what the paper meant. I stood, smoothed the front of my jacket, and looked once at my reflection in the dark window. not to psych myself up, just to confirm I still looked like myself. Then I turned off my desk lamp, picked up my bag, and walked toward conference room 4B. The closer I got, the quieter the hall became. When I reached the door, the blinds inside were already drawn, and I paused with my hand on the handle, listening to the faint, muffled sound of someone shifting in a chair on the other side. I opened the door and stepped into the room without rushing. 3 people were already seated. Marla from HR sat closest to the wall, hands folded, posture tight. 2 compliance reps were beside her, both without laptops, both with that careful stillness people adopt when they've been told not to improvise. No water on the table, no folders, no agenda slide on the screen. That told me more than anything they could have said. Ethan wasn't there. Marla looked up and offered a thin smile that didn't quite arrive on time. "Thanks for joining on short notice," she said. "Of course," I replied. My voice sounded steady to my own ears. I stayed standing. She gestured to the chair across from her. I didn't take it. Not out of defiance. I just didn't see a reason to sit yet. There was a single sheet of paper in front of her, turned face down. The air conditioner clicked on and off like it was unsure whether it was needed. Marla cleared her throat. "So," she began, and paused, as if waiting for the word to soften itself. "I'll get right to it. The company is undergoing a restructuring." I nodded once. No expression, just acknowledgement. "Unfortunately," she continued, "your role is being eliminated effective immediately. This decision has been reviewed and approved by leadership." Leadership. Singular, really. I let the silence stretch for a moment. Not dramatically, just long enough for the sentence to land and finish echoing. "Understood," I said. That seemed to surprise her. Her eyebrows lifted slightly, then settled. People often expect emotion at that moment. Tears, negotiation, something they can react to. She slid the paper toward herself but didn't turn it around. "I'll need your badge," she added, quieter now. I reached into my bag, took it out, and placed it on the table between us. The plastic made a small clicking sound when it hit the surface. That sound felt louder than it should have. One of the compliance reps swallowed. The other adjusted their chair. Marla gathered the badge and hesitated, then said, "Security will escort you out." "That won't be necessary," I replied. "I'll see myself out." Another pause. Then she nodded. I turned and left the room without waiting for confirmation. The hallway outside felt different. Like the building had shifted a few inches and nobody wanted to acknowledge it. I walked past my office without going in, past the elevator bank, and toward the executive floor lifts instead of the garage. No one stopped me. On the ride up, my reflection stared back from the brushed steel walls. I adjusted my collar once, out of habit more than concern. My breathing stayed even. My phone buzzed, but I didn't check it. I got off on the legal and compliance floor. The receptionist looked up this time. Her eyes flicked from my face to the portfolio in my hand. "Do you have an appointment?" she asked. "I was just terminated," I said calmly. "I need to see Daniel Reyes." Her mouth opened slightly, then closed. She picked up the phone without arguing. Daniel had been junior counsel when I first joined. Smart, careful, observant. He used to sit in on my negotiations and ask questions afterward that told me he was actually listening. 10 minutes later, I was in his office. He closed the door behind us. "They let you go?" he asked. "Effective immediately," I said. "No cause cited. No severance beyond standard." He leaned back, processing. "What about your incentive vesting?" I placed the portfolio on his desk and opened it to the page he needed. "Clause 14, subsection C," I said. "Paragraph 3. He scanned it once, then again, slower. His posture changed. Not panic, focus. "This activates if termination occurs within 24 hours of a scheduled vesting," he said quietly. "Yes." "And they signed this?" "They initialed every page." Daniel exhaled through his nose. They thought firing you early would avoid the payout. That's my assumption. He looked up at me. This doesn't avoid it. It triggers it. I know. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the hum of the building systems behind the walls. What do you want to do? He asked. I want this documented, I said, and escalated, correctly. He nodded. I'll start the process. I closed the folder and stood. As I reached the door, he said, They're going to realize what this means. I'm sure they will, I replied. Then I stepped back into the hallway. I didn't go to the elevator right away. I stood there for a second, feeling the weight of the portfolio in my hand, listening to the quiet movement of an office that hadn't caught up to what had already begun. Then I walked on and waited. I didn't leave the building right away. Instead, I walked the length of the legal floor, past rows of offices where people leaned closer to their screens than necessary. A few looked up. Most didn't. The kind of selective attention that keeps plausible deniability intact. Near the end of the corridor, I saw Lena. She sat in a corner workspace with her back half turned to the aisle, one hand on a mouse, the other wrapped around a cooling mug. Lena had started as an intern years ago. I'd signed off on her first rotation, back when she still asked permission before speaking in meetings. Now she knew where everything was stored, and more importantly, how it was stored. She looked up as I stopped beside her desk. You're not supposed to be up here, she said softly. I know, I replied. I won't be long. I placed the folder on her desk and opened it to the same page I'd shown Daniel. She didn't touch it at first, just stared. They terminated you, she said, this morning, one day before vesting. Her eyes moved faster now. She read without comment, lips pressing together as she reached the highlighted section. When she hit the signature block, she stopped. They approved this, she said, not a question. They did. She leaned back in her chair and let out a quiet breath. This clause, it accelerates everything. Yes. And if they contest it, there's a penalty. She closed the folder carefully, as if the paper might cut. Do they know you've submitted this already? Legal does, I said. Compliance will soon. Lena glanced down the aisle, then back at me. You're starting a clock. I'm following a process. She nodded once. That was all. She slid the folder into her drawer and logged into her system. I'll flag it, she said, properly. Thank you. I didn't wait for reassurance. I left her to it. On the elevator down, I finally checked my phone. 3 missed calls. 1 from HR. 2 from an unfamiliar number I didn't recognize. I didn't return any of them. Outside, the city felt louder than it had an hour earlier. Traffic hummed. A delivery truck hissed as it pulled away from the curb. I walked 2 blocks to a small cafe I'd used as a thinking place for years. Same table near the window. Same view of people moving quickly, convinced their urgency mattered. I ordered tea, sat, placed the portfolio beside me. At 10:41 a.m., an email came through. Subject: Contractual Review, Acknowledgement. From Lead Counsel. They confirmed receipt. Timestamped. No tone, no apology, just acknowledgement. That was enough. I took a sip of tea and waited. Inside the building, things were already shifting. I didn't need to see it to know. Paper moves faster than people expect, and signatures don't forget what hands they pass through. Another message arrived. This one from Lena, flagged, circulating. I turned my phone face down on the table. Step 1 was complete. Step 2 would happen without me saying another word. And that was the point. I stayed there for a while, watching reflections move across the glass, listening to the low murmur of conversations that had nothing to do with me. When my tea went cold, I didn't mind. Silence, I'd learned, was only uncomfortable if you didn't understand what it was doing. I let it work. By late morning, I knew better than to expect updates in real time. Processes don't announce themselves. They move quietly, through inboxes and internal systems, through people who suddenly realize they're part of something they didn't plan. That's when mistakes usually happen, not from malice, but from panic. I stayed where I was and let the building do what it always did when pressure showed up. Around noon, my phone buzzed again. This time it was a message, not a call. "Can we talk?" I didn't respond. Instead, I opened my notes app and did something I'd learned to do years earlier, back when I was still trying to convince myself that preparation was optional. I made a short list. Step 1. Documentation delivered to legal and compliance. Step 2. Confirmation timestamped and acknowledged. Step 3. No further communication unless requested through counsel. That was it. No contingencies, no emotional commentary, just sequence. People assume silence means uncertainty. In reality, silence is often a boundary. At 12:27 p.m., another email came through. This one marked confidential. They were reviewing the circumstances of my termination. They used phrases like alignment and internal timing considerations. Nothing specific, nothing actionable. The language felt careful in the way that only happens when someone realizes they may have underestimated the room. I didn't reply. Across town, in a conference room I'd spent years sitting in, conversations were happening without me. I could picture it easily. Someone pulling up my contract on a shared screen. Someone else reading a paragraph aloud more slowly than they'd like. Someone asking, "Who approved this?" And then the inevitable quiet that follows that question. At 1:10 p.m., Lena messaged again. "Comp committee looped in. External counsel notified." I exhaled once and leaned back in my chair. That was the shift. Up until then, this had been an internal issue, a contained situation. Now it belonged to people whose job it was to imagine worst-case scenarios for a living. People who didn't care about office politics or personalities. People who only cared about language, timing, and precedent. I ordered another tea. The cafe had filled up. A pair of consultants argued quietly over a laptop. Someone laughed too loudly near the register. Life continued at its normal pace, which I found grounding. At 1:42 p.m., my phone rang again. This time the number came with a name, Board Liaison. I let it ring twice before answering. "Hello?" I said. There was a brief pause on the other end, the kind that suggests someone is recalibrating expectations. "This is Mark," he said, "from the board." "I know," I replied. "We'd like to understand your position," he continued. His tone was controlled, neutral, professional. "My position is documented," I said. "You have it." Another pause. "Yes," he said. "We do. We're reviewing." "I'm sure you are." He cleared his throat. "Are you seeking a specific outcome?" I looked out the window at a man parallel parking with more confidence than skill. "I'm not seeking anything," I said. "I'm honoring the agreement." Silence stretched. Not uncomfortable, just informative. "We may propose a discussion," he said carefully. "If counsel requests one, I'll consider it," I replied. "Understood." We ended the call without ceremony. I set the phone face down and finished my tea. The rest of the afternoon unfolded exactly as I expected it to. A quiet flurry of internal messages, a reshuffling of responsibility, a growing awareness that this wasn't a misunderstanding to be smoothed over, but a sequence that had already locked into place. By the time the sun began to dip, I received one final message from Lena. "They're reconstructing the timeline. Too late." I allowed myself a small, private nod. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt organized. I gathered my things, stepped back onto the street, and walked home as the city shifted into evening. Traffic slowed, lights came on, offices emptied. Behind me, decisions were being reconsidered by people who no longer had the option of pretending they hadn't been warned. Ahead of me, there was nothing urgent to do. So I let the day end, and I waited. The call came the next morning, just after 8. I was rinsing a mug in my kitchen, the window cracked open enough to let in the sound of traffic starting its day. I dried my hands, picked up the phone, and answered without checking the caller ID. "Good morning," I said. "Emily," a voice replied, calm, deliberate. "This is Thomas Hale, outside counsel for Meridian Group." Meridian had been the firm the board used when things were already past the point of internal resolution. That told me where we were. "Good morning," I repeated. "We'd like to speak with you regarding the circumstances of your termination and the incentive agreement," he said, formally. "I'm available through counsel," I replied. "You should already have that information." "We do," he said. "This would be exploratory, clarifying." I paused, just long enough to be intentional. "Clarification already exists in writing," I said, "but I'll listen." A brief silence, then, "Thank you. We've reviewed Clause 14C. "I assumed you would." "There appears to be disagreement internally about its intent." "There shouldn't be," I said. "Intent is defined by language." He didn't argue. That mattered. "We'd like to propose a meeting," he continued. "In person, neutral location." "Send the request through counsel," I said, "with an agenda." "Understood." We ended the call. 2 hours later, the agenda arrived. It was short. 3 items, no small talk. 1. Confirmation of termination timing. 2. Contractual interpretation. 3. Path forward. I agreed. The meeting took place that afternoon in a downtown office I'd never visited before. Clean lines, glass walls, water already poured. Everyone seated when I arrived. There were 4 of them, 2 attorneys, 1 board representative, and Marla. She didn't look at me when I entered. I took my seat, placed my folder on the table, and waited. Thomas spoke first. "Thank you for coming." "Of course." He turned to Marla. "Please confirm the termination date." She swallowed. "Monday, 9:17 a.m. "And the scheduled vesting?" he asked. "Tuesday, noon." He nodded and turned to me. "That places the termination within the contractual window." "Yes." "The company's position," he continued, "is that the termination was part of a broader restructuring." I didn't respond. He waited a beat, then continued. "However, there is no documentation supporting role elimination prior to that date." "No," I said, "there isn't." Marla shifted in her chair. Thomas adjusted his glasses. "You understand that the company did not intend—" "I'm not concerned with intent," I said calmly. "Only execution." The board representative leaned forward slightly. "Are you open to resolution?" "I'm open to compliance," I replied. Silence settled over the table. Thomas closed his notebook. "Then we'll proceed accordingly." No one raised their voice. No one argued. There was nothing to debate. The meeting ended shortly after. I left the building, stepped into the afternoon light, and felt something loosen. Not emotionally, but structurally. Like a door had finished closing somewhere behind me. The next message would contain numbers. I knew that. So I went home, made dinner, and let the evening arrive without checking my phone. Then I waited. The numbers arrived the following morning. I was seated at my desk at home, sorting through old folders I'd been meaning to clean out for months. Nothing urgent, just paper moving from one place to another. My phone buzzed once, then stayed quiet. I didn't open the message right away. When I did, it was an email from external counsel. No greeting, no soft language. Subject: settlement and payment confirmation. The attachment contained a breakdown: base incentive, accelerated equity, multiplier, a line item for damages tied to termination timing. Everything mapped to dates, clauses, and approvals. The total sat just above $6 million. I read it once, then again, slower. Not because I doubted it, but because this was the moment when facts finished doing their work. There was no argument attached, no request for compromise, just confirmation and a timeline for payment. By noon, a second email followed, this one from the board liaison. They acknowledged the breach. They acknowledged the clause. They confirmed that payment would be processed within 5 business days, contingent on receipt confirmation, not approval of the terms. I forwarded everything to my attorney and closed my laptop. Inside the company, consequences were already moving through their own channels. Marlo resigned that afternoon. It was framed as a personal decision. Everyone understood what it meant. The CEO didn't call. Instead, a short internal notice went out later that week announcing a leadership realignment. Titles changed. Reporting lines shifted. A few names disappeared from the org chart altogether. None of that required my attention. On Friday morning, the payment posted. I checked the account once. Just once. Then I logged out. There was no celebration, no speech, no sense of winning. Just a quiet confirmation that agreements still meant something if you were willing to let them speak for you. That evening, I went for a walk. The weather was mild. The sidewalks were busy in that end-of-week way. People laughing, heading somewhere else. I walked until the sun dipped low enough to soften the edges of the buildings. Then I went home. And for the first time in a long while, I slept without setting an alarm. The next week was quieter than I expected. Not empty, just orderly. I spent the mornings doing small, ordinary things I'd postponed for years. Sorting a drawer that never quite closed. Returning books I'd borrowed and never finished. Cleaning the kitchen properly, including the cabinet nobody ever opens because it sticks. In the afternoons, I walked. No headphones, no calls, just the sound of my steps and the city moving at its own pace. One morning, while reorganizing a shelf, I came across an old notebook from my first year in finance. The pages were uneven, filled with half-formed ideas and notes written too quickly to be elegant. In the margin of one page, I'd written a reminder to myself. Read everything, especially what feels boring. I smiled, closed the notebook, and put it back where it belonged. A few people reached out, former colleagues, quiet messages. No questions mostly, just acknowledgements. A couple asked for advice. One asked if I'd look over an offer letter before they signed it. I said yes, not because I wanted to relive anything, but because I recognized the moment they were standing in. The part before clarity, when things still feel abstract and optional. One afternoon, I received a message from someone I hadn't spoken to in years. A woman I'd once trained briefly during a merger. She wrote that she'd been restructured the week before her stock vested and didn't know what to do next. I told her to send me the paperwork. I made tea and sat at the table while the files loaded. Same calm, same process. Different name at the top. Some patterns repeat because they work. Others repeat because people assume no one is paying attention. I'd learned the difference. That evening, I wiped down the counters, turned off the lights one by one, and sat on the couch with nothing scheduled for the next day. The room felt settled, not victorious, just owned. Before I end, let me say this gently. If you're listening to this and you've ever felt that quiet discomfort, the moment when something feels slightly off, when a meeting appears without context, when paperwork shows up earlier than expected, trust that instinct. Not emotionally, practically. Read, pause, document, then decide. If this story resonated with you, you're very welcome here. Go ahead and like the video if it helped. Subscribe if you want to hear more stories like this, calm, real, and grounded in how things actually work. And I'd love to know where you're listening from. Drop a comment with your city and what time it is for you right now. 2 other stories you might enjoy will be waiting for you next. Thanks for spending this time with me.